You're listening to Arsenal for Democracy, episode 368, recorded on Sunday, April 25th, 2021. I'm your host, Bill Humphrey. Joining me on the line, as always, from Idaho is Rachel. Hello, Rachel.
Hi, Bill.
So we're going to be talking about something from 100 years ago this week. At the end of April of 1921, just ahead of the deadline stipulated in the Treaty of Versailles, the Allied Reparations Commission announced that they had determined that Germany would have to pay 132 billion gold marks, or $33 trillion, in annual installments of 2.5 billion gold marks, basically semi-indefinitely until that was paid off. We're going to talk about what actually happened because that's not what actually happened. But it's notable that, as we've talked about on previous episodes, this finding came despite the already globally famous 1919 book, The Economic Consequences of the Peace, arguing against severe reparations, written by John Maynard Keynes, which had vaulted him to fame. Now, there's a lot of criticisms that have been levied against the work by Keynes, and we're going to talk about some of that today, and we're going to talk also about what actually happened and this gap between sort of the perception or popular recollection of what happened and the actual reality of what happened. But just to sort of summarize the central critique of Keynes, Etienne Mentu, a French economist, and this is quoting him via the Wikipedia article on the World War I reparations. Etienne Mentu, a French economist, was the harshest contemporaneous critic of Keynes in a posthumously published book after 1945, The Carthaginian Peace, or The Economic Consequences of Mr. Keynes. Mentu said that Keynes, quote, had been wrong on various counts, especially with respect to his predictions about Germany's coal, iron, and steel production and its level of national saving. Now, interestingly, the main person who wrote the reparations clauses of the Treaty of Versailles and then was part of the team that I believe set how much was going to be paid was John Foster Dulles, who was, of course, notorious later for his roles in post-World War II U.S. foreign policy and intelligence operations, along with Allen Dulles. But I wanted to talk about, again, that gap between what was forecast and what actually happened and so forth. So, Rachel, you are going to give us the book report on the Keynes book from 1919, and then we'll talk about whether or not he was correct or maybe did some of his predictions influence things to go in a different direction or not. What should we know about the 1919 book, The Economic Consequences of the Peace?
So Keynes really wrote a very doom and gloom overview of what he saw as what reparations would do to Germany. He really thought that because Germany lost some territory, especially the Alsace-Lorraine region, to France, that basically their entire industrial capacity would just be decimated pretty much, and that they would never really be able to dig their way out of their financial obligations just because that industry was so hobbled that they would just never be able to reach pre-World War I levels of industry and would never be able to raise the money to pay off their debts. Like, he estimated that they would lose about 40% of their industrial capability. And he also talked about the human effects. World War I created a very malnourished population due to the blockade. And he saw that malnourishment would really reduce the productivity of the German people, in addition to the casualties of war as well, and the loss of basically the raw materials. So the main industry of Germany at that time was coal and iron, and a lot of that was due to raw materials coming into the country, getting processed, and then exported out of the country. However, if France, if the UK, if the United States weren't going to do business with Germany, that would really reduce their ability to export these goods and make money. And so basically, Keynes was just very, very pessimistic in his view. And he really thought that Germany would just be hobbled for 50 years, especially due to compounding interest required in these reparations. So he foresaw that the interest and the principal of these payments, these annual payments that Germany would have to make, would just be so damaging and so crushing that Germany would never really get out from under the heel, basically, of France and the UK.
Yeah, and as we'll talk about, the sort of popular history is that this is sort of what happened, that the Allied powers crushed Germany under reparations. This fueled this huge backlash, caused all these economic problems that also contributed to the backlash, and that led to the rise of the political far right. And we'll talk about why that's not exactly what actually happened. But to your point, I mean, one of the things that he's sort of arguing against is the French position during the negotiations for the Treaty of Versailles, where France was pretty explicitly saying they wanted harsh reparations to suppress Germany permanently. Historically, I guess those would have been referred to as indemnities, but in this case, the final text and the final agreement ends up only calling them reparations, because the other thing that France legitimately wanted, and you can't really argue that that's not fair, is that they wanted to repair the huge damage to northeastern France from the German occupation and entrenchments. Most of the war took place in part of France and Belgium, and that was under military occupation for pretty much the duration of the war by Germany. There was a lot of other theaters of the war, but really there was almost nowhere where the war was happening in Germany itself, because by the time it was crossing back into German territory, fundamentally the war was just about pretty much over at that point, and Germany was ready to sign the armistice. Now, the British position, and this was, maybe partly influenced by Keynes, maybe not. They had kind of a different agenda than France did. Britain did want to receive some reparations, mostly paying for, veterans' benefits and things like that. But they were asking less than virtually anyone else was willing to accept. They actually wanted a strong German trade partner, but they had not suffered occupations like parts of France or Belgium. The U.S. government was pretty much completely against reparations, broadly speaking, under the Wilson administration. But of course, as we've talked about on previous episodes, Wilson himself was largely out of the picture when a lot of these decisions were made. And by early 1921, when the commission set the amount and so forth and the schedule for payments, he was already out of the presidency. As we'll talk about in just a few minutes, in reality, Germany repeatedly defaulted, or at least failed to deliver on both in-kind reparations of various goods and materials that they were supposed to pay, as well as just gold reparations under even the preliminary figures that were required before April 1921. And they continued to do so even after this commission report came out through the end of 1922. That eventually prompts the UK, France, and Italy to famously occupy the Ruhr industrial area for more than 2.5 years until those troops were withdrawn under the Dawes Plan of 1924, which we'll talk about later. And that, meant that not only had Germany lost its industrial areas in Alsace-Lorraine, but they also lost control of significant areas of the Rhineland industrial capacity while those were under Allied occupation and supervision, because of the fact that they weren't actually paying their reparations on time. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's talk about some of the components of the text of the Treaty of Versailles. So a few interesting points from the Treaty of Versailles that I wanted to go over in relation to the reparations. The Article 233 is what kind of creates the impetus for what happened 100 years ago this week. The findings of the Reparation Commission as to the amount of the damage defined as above shall be concluded and notified to the German government on or before 1st May 1921 as representing the extent of that government's obligations. In Annex 4, they specify a bunch of in-kind reparations, which we don't really hear as much about in the popular history. We mostly just hear about the gold demands. As an immediate advance on account of the animals referred to in paragraph 2A above, Germany undertakes to deliver in equal monthly installments in the 3 months following the coming into force of the present treaty the following quantities of livestock. And again, they pretty much didn't pay this when expected to. To the French government, 500 stallions aged 3 to 7 years, 30,000 fillies and mares 18 months to 7 years, type Ardennais, Boulognese, or Belgian, 2,000 bulls, age 18 months to 3 years, 90,000 milk cows, 2 to 6 years, 1,000 rams, 100,000 sheep, 10,000 goats. To the Belgian government, 200 stallions, age 3 to 7 years, large Belgian type, 5,000 mares, age 3 to 7 years, large Belgian type, 5,000 fillies, 18 months to 3 years, large Belgian type, 2,000 bulls, 18 months to 3 years, 50,000 milk cows, 2 to 6 years, 40,000 heifers, 200 rams, 20,000 sheep, 15,000 sows. The animals delivered shall be of average health and condition. I thought that was interesting. They weren't at least expecting them to be top tier. Anyway, now does Keynes talk at all in the book about these in-kind donations? I mean, there's a lot of discussion that I didn't get into here about coal deliveries and things like that they were supposed to supply France with German coal. But there's also all this livestock as well.
Yeah, he did mention that. He said that just the fact that their coal production was so reduced meant that they wouldn't have enough access to ship to other countries without really impoverishing Germany themselves. And he also mentioned that the livestock was greatly reduced as well, just due to the fact that during the war, people weren't farming them to the same extent that they were before. And also the population had grown so much that the ability of Germany to feed their population without importing foodstuffs was greatly reduced as well. So he was really concerned that if Germany had to export animals like milk cows or sheep or goats, that it was just basically dooming Germany to impoverishment and famine, basically.
Yeah, and famously, of course, in the period from the end of 1918 to basically beginning of 1921, Herbert Hoover, who was by early 1920 or mid 1921 was the Commerce Secretary of the United States under the Harding administration and future president, he had been organizing huge amounts of American-led food relief to make sure that the German people did not starve, because the food situation was quite dire at that point. It had been quite bad during the war, and during the war, Hoover had initially even come to prominence at all because he was an American businessman in Britain who was organizing food relief for the occupied areas of Belgium and France and so forth, basically doing private food organizations that would get food delivered to those areas. I don't remember the specific details of how they negotiated everything with Germany to be able to make those deliveries, but that was sort of the gist of it. And they did have to figure out how to feed that population. In terms of the coal, I mean, that's another interesting one, but then you can see why France was maybe frustrated as well. Now, I think, is Keynes' position basically that, like, why would you be asking for additional coal supplies when you've now transferred Alsace-Lorraine back to France with its coal fields? But the French position was, well, we lost a huge amount of coal fields that Germany sabotaged and destroyed. I mean, Germany apparently had destroyed a whole bunch of coal mines in the occupied areas of northeastern France, which is a bit odd, too. I was trying to figure out what the deal was with that. Did they just destroy them at the end as they were pulling out, or had they destroyed them at the beginning for whatever reason, instead of just keeping them in operation for Germany to use during the war. I don't know. That I didn't know as much about that, so I was kind of trying to get my head around that as we were going through this.
Yeah, he didn't mention the time frame. He did mention that Germany did destroy a lot of the French mines. Um, he I he did write about the coal fields of Alsace-Lorraine going to France, and it seemed like the fact that they were still demanding more coal in excess of what was ceded to France was one of those things that was just like uh, very injurious to Germany, and almost too injurious to Germany. It was seen as really punitive rather than just reparations. And also to kind of circle back to Hoover, Keynes really kind of had a dim view of the American contingent of the reparations committee, including President Wilson. He seemed to feel that President Wilson was a little bit too inflexible and, I guess, like Protestant in his negotiation tactics, and a little bit slow to change. And he said that Prime Minister Clemenceau of France and Prime Minister Lloyd George of the UK were just basically able to talk circles around him and negotiate him into a position that initially he said he would never be supportive of. So just Wilson was too slow, and he didn't really know at what point to dig his toes into the ground, so to speak, and really stick to a position. So they were just able to outmaneuver him and really get him to agree to things that ostensibly he would never have agreed to, because he didn't want to be overly punitive to Germany. But Keynes did really appreciate Hoover and really thought he was a good man, and really spoke well of him in his book.
Now, nominally, the other Central Powers were supposed to pay reparations too, and of course, as we alluded to earlier, there had been multiple fronts of the war, and certain areas had taken pretty significant damage as well at the hand of those other powers. However, in practice, Germany ended up really being the only one on the hook. Austria and Hungary were now separate countries, and they were rump states, both of them. Bulgaria was very poor, so they ended up getting their obligations waived pretty quickly. And the Ottoman Empire was expected initially to potentially have to do some significant reparations, except that the Ottomans ceded huge territories south of Anatolia, the places that are now, Syria, Iraq, so forth, all those sort of areas. And so that was going to be credited to, offset their reparations. And then the Ottoman Empire just completely collapsed, as we've talked about on other episodes. And its successor state, Turkey, was at war with the Allies by the time this commission work was wrapping up in early 1921. And that war was continuing on for a couple more years after that. So Turkey ended up basically not having to pay any reparations at all. And so Germany, ended up on the hook for basically all of the costs of the war damage and so forth. And as, of course, Russia was a whole other situation and had made a separate peace, so they weren't involved in any of this. But that was sort of the situation that we are left with by this period at the end of April of 1921. And now I think it's time that we talk about what actually happened in practice, because, of course, in theory, we've got this really harsh treaty that Keynes is arguing against, and they go ahead and levy all these reparations anyway. But the question is that really what actually happened? Again, there's the narrative that, they crushed Germany, that it hurt their economy so badly, and then they led to the political far right, and that the far right was also emboldened by these reparations burdens to say, look how unfair this is, etc. So did Germany really bear the brunt of the economic costs of reparations? That's kind of not really supported by the evidence. It seems like they basically managed to avoid most of the planned reparations demanded at this point in 1921. And they rebuilt their own economy pretty quickly, partly by avoiding these reparations. Again, the French objective had partly been intentionally to slow down the German reconstruction. And, remember, as we said, most of the battles and the occupations were not in Germany during the war. Yes, they lost significant territory in the peace with France and Poland, but the European allies were thinking they would be able to rebuild by, using these reparations from Germany, and that ended up not really happening. Meanwhile, Germany was able to sort of bounce back pretty quickly. They didn't have to, there were certain things they needed to retool the economy back towards civilian purposes. But other than that, they weren't really rebuilding a ton of stuff. Maybe they were moving some factories or something along those lines, or having to build new ones because they had lost some in like Alsace-Lorraine. But other than that, the European allies actually struggled to rebuild in the absence of German payments and trade because Germany wasn't cooperating with what they had said they were going to have to pay. And it is true that the domestic political perception in Germany was that the reparations had been crushing and unfair. But even the German government's own very high estimates of how much they actually paid, both in gold and in kind, puts their actual payments at about half the amount set in 1921 in terms of what they ended up finally paying out before sort of the whole thing was called off. And that, again, that's Germany's government's estimates, which are generally considered to be much higher than what sort of external estimates are. Some of the outside estimates that I saw not only placed the figure at a fraction of that half, but also suggested that the Western, mostly U.S. financial assistance in the half decade after the war was so great that Germany actually netted more money on balance than it sent away, which sort of undermines this narrative that the reparations were so economically devastating and crushing and so forth that it led to this political fascism or whatever. I wonder if you had any thoughts about that, Rachel.
Yeah, the way Keynes wrote about it, he wrote everything in dollar amounts, so it made it seem that despite any volatility with the mark, that they would kind of be on the hook for these like dollar amounts, and that's not the way it turned out at all. So it really made it seem much worse than how it actually turned out with the Western financial assistance that actually really helped Germany pay out this money and really put them in this advantageous financial situation.
Yeah, and hyperinflation stuff remains a huge political fixation of a lot of the world. The German hyperinflation of the early 1920s and so forth, that's like kind of this continual boogeyman that gets brought up in all kinds of comparisons, basically never correctly and never appropriately. I think it also makes it hard to assess the amount of reparations that they actually paid, and it made it hard at the time to assess how much reparations they were paying and so forth. Because if the reparations are to be made in marks, and you can say, well, it's fine, they're going to be paid in, X amount of gold, and then you can sort of melt down the gold or whatever. That I'm not necessarily super familiar with. So maybe the hyperinflation didn't really change things that much. But I think there's a lot of people who would argue that the hyperinflation helped Germany get out of some of these debts, and that may have even been an intentional policy. That I don't know enough about to really be able to assess, but I think that's worth asking that question anyway. Some other things to consider here. One thing that Keynes didn't necessarily, I'm not sure he was aware of it because he, was writing from the British perspective and maybe wasn't on the ground in Germany checking the books from the wartime period. Germany had had a very bad fiscal situation due to wartime borrowing without making any tax hikes, not due to reparations. My understanding from this is Germany basically had been under the impression for most of the war that they were going to win the war, and therefore they would be the ones demanding reparations from other countries. And we'll talk later on about sort of some precedents for why they may have thought that. And so operating from that viewpoint, they did not make appropriate fiscal provisions during the war to pay for the war. And so they ended up not only getting dinged by the reparations to some degree or another, but there's a lot of scholarship that argues that even with no reparations being demanded whatsoever, that Germany would have initially been in a pretty bad fiscal situation and ended up with some of those economic problems that they saw, regardless of reparations, and that the reparations were basically unrelated to that. They just had mismanaged the budget and stuff under the final years of the monarchy, and then, transferred to this new republic and so forth. Other interesting counter considerations here. One thing that Keynes, I guess, doesn't mention in the book or really acknowledge is that Germany was able to cut its defense spending dramatically, obviously partly just by ending the war, and you don't have as many sort of ongoing expenses like paying out everybody's frontline wages and buying new ammunition and so forth. But they were, by the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, being forced to demilitarize for the most part, and that should have actually saved them a huge amount of money, right? The concept of the peace dividend from like the 90s after the Cold War ended, you get to cut back your defense spending and so forth. That's going to net you a whole bunch of extra money. So the question is, why did he not really acknowledge that as a potential source of money to reinvest in the German economy, to pay off these reparations and so forth? And he didn't seem to really address that.
Yeah, it's interesting. He didn't really talk about that, but he, interestingly enough, did talk about how France and Italy also had a bad fiscal situation.
That's true.
due to that wartime borrowing without tax hikes. And he kind of contrasted that with the UK, which did at the time during the war increase taxes on the people, whereas France and Italy did not. So I'm wondering if that's what kind of really put them on the back foot in a way that Keynes didn't really apply to Germany at the time, or the fact that Germany could just cut their defense spending dramatically, whereas France did keep troops in Germany for some time after the war. So maybe that also kind of hurt them because they were paying money to their military during this time.
So one other consideration that I wanted us to make here in this discussion is sort of an interesting philosophical one, which is, should we be evaluating the amount paid in reality or the amount demanded? And I don't just mean this in terms of like political popular perception. I mean that in terms of what they actually paid, yes, there was not much economic damage, if any, to Germany, according to most scholarship at this point. However, if they had indeed been forced to pay the rest expected, especially through 1988, which was one of the final renegotiated schedules, was that they were going to be paying reparations through 1988, would that have potentially vindicated Keynes? I mean, it seems like a lot of his stuff ended up being like very doomer and didn't really pan out, but partly because Germany didn't end up paying the reparations. But, they were staring down the barrel of quite a long period of reparations, almost longer than anyone could sort of really wrap their minds around. And was that maybe having a real influence on sort of policy decisions in a way that is overlooked if we just look at what was actually paid?
One thing that Keynes mentioned was that if all your excess wealth and labor was kind of bleeding out of the country, it really has a demoralizing effect on the workers. So I'm wondering if there was that sort of long-term payout schedule that would have really had a depressing effect on the productivity and the morale of workers if you don't really see any benefits to being productive and to creating all this wealth. I can see how it would definitely make you disincentivize the workers. So maybe that would have had some of those real bad effects that Keynes was talking about.
And I guess that's the argument for why you'd have this political backlash and the right rising up. Although the other problem with that narrative is that a lot of the political far right in Germany was being explicitly sponsored by the heights of capital in Germany. You had very rich individuals, capitalists, industrialists, tycoons, financiers, and so forth, who were bankrolling the far right, both out of a patriotic nationalist sentiment, but as well as just to achieve various sort of political objectives they had in mind. And of course, the Nazis rewarded that by privatizing huge amounts of state industry and selling them off to those type of people when they eventually came to power. It's something a lot of people don't realize is that the term privatization in the English language comes from trying to describe the process of the Nazi economic policy with regard to state industries. There was existing terms in German for that because it was not the first time that they had privatized things in German history, but this was a particularly sort of notable wave that happened after the Nazis took power. It's instrumentalized as well for these industrialists and so forth to say, hey, we don't want to be paying for this stuff. We don't want to be shipping this stuff out of the country for free. We want to be selling it on the open market, whether domestically or abroad. Let's use this sort of political backlash to achieve our various objectives as well. And I think to your point that idea of we're going to be under this boot heel for, literally decades upon decades was going to anger a lot of people and provide a lot of fuel for this sort of political backlash. So some other things to think about as we talk about this. One thing that I was wondering was, did the European allies also need these reparations themselves to pay off U.S. debts? The common thing that we hear about is the reconstruction costs and the idea of punishing Germany, whether or not that was explicit or implicit. But another thing that we should be thinking about is the role of the U.S. Financial markets and capitalists and so forth. So in September 1915, over a year into the war, the British and French governments jointly borrowed $500 million without collateral from the private credit markets in the United States, led by J.P. Morgan and Company, newly led by Jack Morgan Jr. J.P. Morgan Sr. had just died a few years before World War I. And numerous other investment bankers, including, as we'll talk about, Charles Dawes, were part of this huge $500 million deal. And this was bonded over 5 years, i.e. to late 1920, at a rate of 5%. It was the largest loan in world history at that point. And rail tycoon James J. Hill of the Great Northern Railway System remarked at the time that it was essentially the official transition point of the rising U.S., quote, from being a debtor to a creditor nation. End quote. And interestingly, again, Russia is an outlier among the allies here. They were supposed to be originally considered for part of this deal, and they were almost immediately excluded from it due to the official czarist anti-Semitism policies that were not very popular with a lot of the financial actors in the United States in the private financial markets. But the Anglo-French Financial Commission that went to the U.S. to get this money, they essentially organized this loan within the United States private credit markets by J.P. Morgan to then have J.P. Morgan and Company turn around and make purchases within the United States to make materiel purchases, essentially, for the Allied war effort in Europe. This was before the U.S. entered the war in 1917. The British government was trying to avoid converting pounds to dollars and physically moving pounds out of the country and across the Atlantic. So dollar-to-dollar transactions within the United States were better for them. And interestingly, John Maynard Keynes took over the oversight of U.S. purchases after J.P. Morgan and Company made, I will diplomatically call it, a major screw-up in late 1916. And this is, I'm citing here from Britain, America, and the Sinews of War, 1914 to 1918, by Kathleen Burke from 1985. I read part of that book for this. And you talked about the sort of financial situation of Britain relative to the other countries. And, interestingly, they ended up having to cover all of the U.S. purchases by other major European allies, Italy, Russia, and even France by 1916. And they were guaranteeing those, but they still ended up with a better situation. They had better finances in general. They had these private expat networks where they could make all kinds of complicated financial transactions for the war effort within the United States among sort of the British financial elite living in the United States, and that was very helpful for their sort of purchasing and so forth. So they ended up being kind of okay, but you've got these other countries like France and Italy that are on the hook for substantial amounts of money. And to them, I think they're looking at this and saying, well, we need these reparations from Germany, not just for our reconstruction, but because we've got to be able to pay off the United States as well. That I don't know if he addresses in the book at all, but that I think that was a motivating factor for some of the decision making.
He talked about the U.S. like public dollars, like the government dollars, but he didn't really talk about the private money that was coming from the U.S., which is kind of interesting because he did take over that the oversight of the U.S. purchases. So it's really interesting that he didn't like stipulate to that at all. So maybe a blind spot for him or something he just kind of wanted to obscure. But yeah, I think he talked about how the U.S. as a state didn't really want reparations just because they didn't have as much skin in the game as these other countries did. Like there was no fighting happening on their territories, and they really did enter the war late in the game, so they just hadn't spent as much as a state as the other countries had. So it was something he just kind of really skipped over.
Now, to go back to that quote from James J. Hill of the Great Northern Railway, the private lending during the war to Britain and Company from the U.S., that, as he said, marks the transition from the U.S. being a debtor nation to a creditor nation. But if you want to talk about what really sort of cements that in place, I think it is actually the reparations and the American intervention to try to straighten out the reparations, which, as we said, basically had gone off the rails as soon as the Treaty of Versailles ink was dry and well before this April 1921 announcement of how much was going to be expected of Germany in total. And this brings us to the Dawes Plan of 1924. So as we said, things go off the rails pretty quickly. Eventually, we have the occupation of the Ruhr industrial area in the Rhineland by the Allied powers out of frustration with the failure to comply with basically any of the terms of the reparations, both gold and in-kind transfers. And the Americans are like, look, all right, we got to get this situation sorted out. We don't want all of these huge economic drag effects happening in Europe. That's not good for trade either. We don't want people to starve, and we don't want there to be all these tensions around military occupation and so forth. So the Dawes Plan of 1924 was brokered by one of the participants of that earlier private credit deal that we talked about. But this was, as you said, now we're talking about more in the nature of public dollars or publicly backed private transactions. This was brokered by Chicago-based American banker and the first U.S. Budget Bureau Director, Charles G. Dawes, who would be elected Vice President of the United States later in 1924. And the Dawes Plan would reorganize German central banking and government finances. It would backload the reparations schedule instead of front-loading it, and it would provide Germany with $200 million in bridge loan financing from Wall Street. Now, again, we're talking about $200 million in that amount of money at the time, and although there had been some wartime inflation in terms of the dollar value, remember that huge, record-shattering private lending thing that happened in 1915 was $500 million, just to give you a comparative scale here. So now we're getting another enormous loan, and this is where we talk about, as alluded to earlier, the fact that Germany actually seems to have netted more money on balance coming into the country than they had to pay out in reparations. The bridge loans from Wall Street on the order of $200 million allowed Germany to rebuild its economy faster and thus build more capacity to pay reparations. Unfortunately, the plan negotiated in 1924 also ended those in-kind coal reparations to France, which had experienced, as we talked about earlier, significant destruction of its own coal fields during the occupation. And this change in policy to end the in-kind coal transfers slowed the regrowth of France's steel industry relative to Germany's. And that, of course, becomes important for World War II because Germany had a fully reconstructed and vital steel industry able to do military production, and France was really still lagging behind. The Dawes Plan didn't necessarily work out that great either. And again, the idea here was, okay, we are going to provide bridge loans from the United States to Germany. They're going to be able to use this to rebuild their economy and pay off some of their reparations. That, of course, also still doesn't really happen in terms of the reparations, and so they still need to continue renegotiating this. That brings us to the Young Plan of 1929, also negotiated by the United States, which created a more permanent plan for handling German reparations, but, as we said earlier, that mapped out payments through 1988, which was such a shock and point of resentment that it triggered a political crisis in Germany, which collapsed the plan. Interestingly, although we think of Germany as having just this horrible economy for all of the 1920s, in fact, the early 1920s is when you have the period of the hyperinflation problems and just economic catastrophe in general there. And then 1929, you have when the Young Plan is being negotiated, and then the German government collapses because of the political backlash to this plan. You have the arrival of the Great Depression rippling around the financial markets of the world. And in between, Germany's economy actually did quite great. In between these two periods, maybe it wasn't peachy for the average person, but where was that true at that point in world history? But for the most part, the German economy had pretty much recovered and was kind of roaring along for a while, or at least chugging at a respectable pace. And that's why I think they thought, we'll be able to renegotiate this plan and get things back on track. But again, that just doesn't really happen. So President Hoover, who now is the U.S. president at this point, he puts a moratorium for 1 year on reparations, thinking, okay, we'll come back to this later. It's not a problem. We'll be able to negotiate this. The markets will recover from the Great Depression, which of course we know didn't end up happening as quickly as hoped. But in mid-1932, they did negotiate, or agree to at least, a final modest lump sum payment. Now, I am unclear on whether or not even that payment actually got made. Again, at this point, they're pretty far behind the curve, and they're trying to do an exit negotiation on these reparations completely. And this new deal was going to end reparations completely. And as I said, this was mid-1932, but that's really less than half a year before Hitler came to power. And of course, he was like, no, thank you. I will not be paying anything at all. West Germany in the mid-20th century did make some further payments, but those were on outstanding debt obligations rather than on the reparations themselves. So this gets to that point again about the net gains by Germany. So Hitler refused to repay the Allied bridge loans that were made to help with the reparations and reconstruction. West Germany, and then subsequently in the 1990s, reunified Germany, did pay off some of those debts, but they never did pay off the reparations. And because those loans were intended to help pay for the reparations, that meant that effectively, at least until through the end of World War II, Germany just kept the money. That was the bridge loans. So again, we get into this perception versus reality question, and it seems like there's a bit of a gap there. Rachel, I know we have one more little subtopic to get to, but did you have any thoughts about the American intervention there?
Not so much about the American intervention, but just like that perception versus reality. So Keynes kind of wrote his book from the perception that France were these big meanies that were trying to extract as much wealth from Germany as possible to permanently cripple them. But the reality is just Germany's refusal to pay really put France in a disadvantageous position that really had those ripple effects throughout the decades to come, especially during those World War II years where Germany was able to kickstart their steel industry, whereas France just really could not stand up to them or keep up with them. So it's really interesting how there is that like pop history perception of how this treaty went and how this reparations committee went that just doesn't seem to square with what happened.
Yeah, and France did manage to sort of rebuild those areas by shortly before the World War II kicked off, or around the opening phases of World War II, basically just in time for it to not matter and get overrun completely again. It could have been worse because, if we're talking about Germans complaining about having to pay out until 1988 and so forth, I've read things before that suggest that the initial French estimates were that the reconstruction of their occupied areas from World War I was going to take them until the 1960s to fully rebuild. I think John Maynard Keynes would have probably looked at that, given his other sort of economic philosophies, and said, no, it's not going to take that long because you're going to essentially be creating a giant government spending program to create all these jobs, and that's going to have this very positive ripple effect of basically what we would now call Keynesian economics, especially in those areas that had been under occupation and needed to be rebuilt. There was also the question of, reintegrating Alsace-Lorraine after so many decades in German hands. But, it was still not great, as we said, and it seems like Germany basically recovered much faster than France, whereas, as you said, the pop history is that German fascism is innately tied to the weakness of the German economy, the economic hardships and so forth, blah, 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 and that's just not necessarily an accurate reflection of the situation. Now, we've been talking a lot about Alsace-Lorraine throughout this, and that was for the most part, a predominantly Germanic-speaking area that had been part of France and was transferred to Germany as a result of the Franco-Prussian War in 1871. The war ended in 1871. And then, they spent basically half a century in German hands. We talked about the sort of heavy industry there. And this was a major recovery objective for France during this war, was that they were determined to get that territory back and bring it back under French control. And this was going to be hugely important for the French industrial economy and so forth. But there's another element to the Franco-Prussian War that I don't think comes up very often in the popular sort of recounting of this around the narratives around the Treaty of Versailles and so forth. And I think it's important to understand in terms of this reparations discussion, and we'll close out on that for this week's free episode. So this is a relevant thing, I think, to bring up as well, considering that, yes, we're talking about the 100th anniversary of this reparations commission work. We're also talking this spring about the 150th anniversary of both the Paris Commune uprising and the Franco-Prussian War coming to an end. And one thing that you don't hear that much about, because the focus is on the transfer of territory in Alsace-Lorraine, is that there was an enormous war reparations cost imposed. It would have been referred to, I think, as indemnities at the time, but we retroactively use the same term as with World War I reparations. And this was demanded by Germany, and they had a much more sort of effective strategy of ensuring that France actually paid it out, which was that the German army had occupied huge areas of France during the war, and especially the Paris Commune situation. And they said, we will not pull out the German troops until you've paid your reparations, and we will remove troops at a proportional rate to how much you've paid off in terms of your reparations. So there were some interesting sections that I wanted to quote from the Wikipedia page. This is kind of random that I found these, but anyway, the Wikipedia page for Adolphe Thiers, and that is in turn sourced from an exhaustive 1983 biography of Adolphe Thiers by French historian René Delacroix de Castries. And Thiers is a super important figure for both the July monarchy earlier in French history, as well as the sort of formation of the Third Republic, which was the system that lumbered along kind of ineffectually all the way through this period, including World War I, and all the way until it collapsed at the beginning of World War II. But this gives us an insight into the reparations terms demanded by Germany during that war. And it is my suspicion that a major factor in French policy is sort of revengist policy, which we use the term revanchist for the French term there, is not just the recovery of territory, but also the recovery of money. And the French perspective was pretty upset about the amount of money that they had been required to pay to Germany, and I think they were trying to get some of it back 50 years later with that deal. So here are some passages on that I thought were interesting. So when Thiers arrived at the hotel, he met the Prussian Field Marshal Moltke, who told him, "You are lucky to be negotiating with Bismarck. If it were me, I would occupy your country for 30 years, and in that time there would be no more France." At the first meeting, Bismarck demanded the province of Alsace and 8 billion francs. Thiers insisted that France could pay no more than 5 billion francs, and Bismarck reduced the payment, but insisted that Germany must have part of Lorraine and Metz as well instead. The talks were long and stressful. At one point, Thiers, exhausted, broke down and wept. Bismarck helped him to a sofa, covered him with his overcoat, and said, "Ah, my poor Monsieur Thiers, there is no one but you and I who really love France." The negotiations resumed, and Thiers conceded Alsace and part of Lorraine in exchange for a reduction in the payment. He told the other French delegates, quote, "If we lose one or two provinces, it is not of great importance. There will be another war when France will be victorious, and we will get them back. But the billions we give to Germany now, we will never recover." Once the Commune had fallen to the French army, Thiers turned his attention to liberating French soil from German occupation. He had lost Alsace and part of Lorraine, with a total population of 1.6 million of the 36.1 million inhabitants of France. The government had a deficit of nearly 3 billion francs. France owed Germany 5 billion francs under the terms of the peace, which had to be paid largely in gold. And the destruction during the Paris Commune required 232 million francs to repair. Thiers used his considerable financial skills to find the money. He borrowed the money from the Bank of France and the Morgan Bank in London, and in June 1871 he issued bonds, which brought in over 4 billion francs. In July 1871, Thiers was able to pay the first 500 million francs of the payment to Germany. In exchange, as they had promised, the Germans withdrew their troops from 3 departments. Thiers' priority was to rid the country entirely of the German occupation of the east and north of France. By September 1871, after the payment of 1.5 billion francs, 6 more departments were liberated, but 12 were still occupied until the debt could entirely be paid off. That sum amounted to 1/6 of the entire budget of the Republic. By 1873, the primary goal of Thiers was to pay off the debt to Germany, to liberate the last French territory occupied by the Germans. France still owed 3 billion francs, more than the national budget, with final payment due in August 1875. He made agreements with the major 55 banks of Europe and issued bonds, which, based on the good credit of France, brought in more than the amount required. Thiers signed a new convention with Germany on the 15th of March, 1873, calling for the Germans to leave the last 4 French departments they held by July of 1873, 2 years ahead of schedule. So that is the section about the reparations that Germany demanded and received in full from France during the after the Franco-Prussian War as part of the terms of the peace, 50 years before the 100 years ago that we're talking about with the World War I reparations. So, Rachel, I know that's a little bit further afield, but I was wondering if you had any sort of reactions to that and thoughts about the sort of reparations process there and the extensive private financial negotiations that had to happen to make that work.
Yeah, it's really interesting to me that the occupation continued until the payments were made. And also, I can definitely see where France was coming from in the reparations committee negotiations, especially with Prime Minister Clemenceau, who is an older politician. So this history was probably definitely fresh in his mind when he was negotiating and trying to create these terms that were going to be punishing for Germany. I'm sure there was definitely a lot of that revenge motivation behind these negotiations.
All right. Well, our episode on this has probably gone on long enough, but Rachel, thank you so much for reading the 1919 book by John Maynard Keynes, The Economic Consequences of the Peace, and then coming on to discuss with me what the actual economic consequences of the peace were.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure.